People are very puzzled when I talk about Heidegger, but they don't understand my implicit chronologization of thinkers within the history of thought. Heidegger is an important stepping stone. I'm already assuming Kojève is correct in his departure from Heidegger. I'm assuming Lacan is correct in his, and it culminating maybe in Zizek or something, right? Like, I'm just talking about where you're missing. Not you, but like Western leftists. Like, you haven't gone through the Heidegger pill. And they're like, well, I want to retain my revolutionary outlook. I want to retain my Marxism. And it's like, don't worry, you'll retain it. But they're worried because they think they're going to lose something.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's like, you're not going to lose it because you haven't gained it in the first place. When I was talking about the notion of the revolutionary spark, that's the faith they lack. They don't believe in a fundamental revolutionary spark. You know what? I'll go through Heidegger. I'll go through the Ayatollah. I'll go through literally every mystical, whatever gibberish thinker you want. And I still believe that I'll be on the right path. I'm not scared to be tempted by other ideas because my convictions and my revolutionary outlook comes from something more fundamental than an idol. I don't have an idol. The idol is not an idea. It's not an ideal. It's not a thought. I don't have an idol. I am a Marxist because I have a continuous and present reproduction and reaffirmation of a more fundamental revolutionary outlook. And if you don't have faith in the revolutionary spark within you, you can't be a Marxist in the first place. Look at the Kotskys and the Bernsteins and others. Oh, they were great Marxists, quote unquote. And why is it that Lenin had to radically break with them in the way that he did, so violently and so abruptly? Because Lenin had what they didn't. He had the same intensity of the revolutionary spark.
Would you have freedom from wage slavery and join in the grand industrial band? Would you from misery and hunger be free and come to your share like a man? There is power in a band of working men. That's some power that must rule in every land. Would you have mansions of gold in the sky and a living shack way out in the back? Would you have wings up in heaven to fly and starve here with rags on your back? There is power in a band of working men. That's a power that must rule in every land. If you had enough of the blood of the lamb, then join the grand industrial band. If you'd rather feast off your own land, then come do your share like a man. There's power in a band of working men. There's power that will across the land. from every land, then join the grand announcement. Then our share of this earth we shall demand. Come and do your share like a man. There is power, there is power in the band of working men. There is power, there is power that will rule in every land. There is power, there's this power that will rule in every land.
Welcome, everyone, to a very special episode of Escaping the Cave with Dr. GARRIDO. Up to now, we've been primarily doing geopolitics conversations, which is not what I initially wanted and intended for the show. I wanted it to be primarily a philosophy show, but we've had interesting situations where we bring on philosophers, we have conversations, and then after the fact is when these geniuses look up who we are and they're like, wow, you guys like Stalin and Russia. I don't want this posted. So fuck them. We have a real philosopher on today. My comrade, my brother, Howz al-Din, executive chairman of the American Communist Party, and also the showrunner, one of the lead. Well, what's the official category for infrared that you have?
It's like Ankar, brother number. No, I'm kidding. We don't have. I mean, on in a way though, you know, for infrared. The technical thing is that I'm one of 11 showrunners.
You
We
know,
just call ourselves the showrunner.
I've always thought of it like the Ninja Turtle, like the master rat, the one that trains all the other
This
ones.
is, you know what? This is the second time, and this has never left me, that you called me a fucking Ninja Turtle. I don't know what the fuck it means, all right?
I fuck with
Like,
the Ninja
it's
Turtle.
got to be something to do with my posture or something. I don't like it, man. It's hurting my feelings.
It's not racially nor posturally motivated.
Racial? How would that be racial? I don't
Well-
even. This is the most racist thing anyone's told me because it's a racial insult that's so mysterious. Like I don't even know what it could mean.
Wearing a green fluffy thing too.
Yeah, there's something. Yeah, something. There's something to that. I haven't forgot about that. Anyway, let's make it more serious, right?
I don't
Right.
remember calling you a Ninja Turtle.
You did. You did. We went to the gym. You said I have a Ninja Turtle style when I lift. I don't know what the fuck that meant. It hasn't left me.
It's a compliment. I just brought down my box of old toys for my kid, and it's just a bunch of Ninja Turtles. It's take it as a
All right,
compliment.
yeah. If I hear about Ninja Turtles one more time, I'm gonna lose my mind. This is like a curse.
Um, I've been meaning to talk to you, and I think it'd be good for us to have a public conversation about some of the statements that you have said about philosophy, about philosophers that you identify with and draw inspiration from and take insights from. That for the outsider, for individuals that are not familiar with the history of philosophy and that just have a very vulgar understanding of Marxism, in the worst sense of that word, um, they find problematic. So there's two that come to mind that you have addressed very briefly in one of the videos you did for the ACP channel, Heidegger and Dugin. But there's also one thinker that we're both very much influenced by with it, which is Zizek. Um, as I think I've told you, when I was doing my initial bachelor work on philosophy, I was already a communist, and naturally I was like, well, who's a communist and a philosopher that's alive? And the first thing that pops up is Zizek and Badiou, and I just read as much as I could of them. And then I entered into this weird period in grad school because of some of the academics that I was hanging out with, where it was almost bad form to reference anyone that didn't have politically the same alignment as we do as Marxist-Leninists. And I strayed away from Zizek. And as those connections with people like Rockhill and others have fallen through because of their own purity fetish and their condemnations of the ACP and stuff and of the Institute, Um, I have slowly gone back to rereading Zizek, and I realized that so many of, what I would consider to be some of my best insights, are in part drawn and inspired by lessons that I had early on learned from him. So, do you want to start there? What is it that drew you to Zizek?
I actually want to briefly, like really briefly, touch on the Rock Hill thing because look, the truth is, on a on like a base level, he's right. Within academic institutions, especially after the 90s, being an actual ML was just fundamentally unthinkable. And there's a reason there's a reason you and I, Carlos, found Zizek because he was on the front page of YouTube, because he was promoted on mainstream media, because he was given a platform. And it's obvious that as a precondition of that, he cannot align with, and we don't even have a term for this yet. We could use like phrases, but I think there's like the free world and then there's the based world. Let's just call it that, right? There's not a chance in hell Zizek could have aligned with the based world like, Dugin does objectively. Say what you want about him. He's like totally pro North Korea, totally pro every Venezuela, like you name it, right? And like Zizek would not have been promoted. If he did that, he would have been an extremely obscure figure. And that doesn't mean he would have been wrong, but it would have meant that it would have been harder for people like us to find him. And I find that an interesting paradox. And it maybe Chomsky's a little similar with respect to that. Chomsky's clearly pro-establishment, clearly promoted, but at the same time, if he was more radical, he wouldn't have the reach that he does. And therefore, the pipeline for people go down that ends in, you and I, would have been closed off, right? And so I can't be upset at Zizek for being a shill, so to speak, in the way that Rockhill would say he is. And that's just with respect to his geopolitics. Geopolitically, he's basically aligned with NATO. He's aligned with the West. But I think he is self-aware. I think he knows what it means. I don't think he's a disingenuous shill. For example, Bernard Henry Levy. Like, Zizek hates that guy. Zizek hates the NATO shills who are actually just propagandists and ideologists. Whereas Zizek, I'm not saying this is the case, but the way that he justifies his geopolitical alignment is a kind of mental gymnastics that reminds me of like what a persecuted heretic would, like, engaging in taqiyya would do to basically mask their position, which I don't think he's doing, but it has that structure. Like, he's not a naive idiot who's just going to be pro-NATO because, well, it's the free world or whatever. Like, he definitely does have a critical distance to the ideology for sure. And to me, that critical distance to ideology, just at I'm talking about Zizek, the pop political thinker. It's that critical distance that opened up the possibility for a more radical form of engagement with Marxism for me personally. A lot of people go down an ultra-left pipeline from Chomsky to anarchism to, I don't know, they go down all these crazy pipelines. Whereas for me, the very critique of ideology and critical distance toward ideology and narratives and whatever that Zizek skillfully employed made it quite impossible that I would have follow in his footsteps and be pro-NATO in my orientation. And the reasoning he employs, though it leads to a false conclusion, I think is a more correct step than the Rockhill kind of vulgar movementism, whatever you want to call it, where you're kind of taking Western leftism and then applying it to geopolitics and all of that naivety and idealism that comes with that, which I think is just woefully misguided, because you're setting yourself up for disappointment. Because these people have to lie to us and tell us the DPRK is like a woke country in the Western liberal humanitarian sense. It's absolutely not. There's absolutely a ruggedness, a brutality in a way of the proletarian dictatorships, which I don't think the sentiment of people like Rockhill and the sensibility is aligned with at all. Ironically, I think Zizek's sensibilities do fit more in line with the kind of Stalinist.
In fact, there's this quote that I used from Zizek in a recent article I did for Al Mayadeen, where I draw three lessons that the last week should give us. The first lesson is that if you're in the global south, you need nukes, because if not, you're cooked, you're fucked. And the second one was that Stalinism was completely right. And I cite that Twitter post that you had, that all communist dictatorships have been fully justified. And I cite Zizek right after, because he makes an argument which is very interesting, which is that the true communist, or the Leninist, as he calls it, I would say Marxist-Leninist, is like the authentic conservative, in that they're willing to take responsibility and get their hands dirty through the act. And there's something to Western leftism that, even when it takes the form of these people that come to accept formally these states, these communist states, and this tradition, they're not willing to take responsibility for what that means in the ways in which the states they already claim to support take. They're not willing to take that step. And I think it's very telling when it was that a lot of these academics came to break with us. And I personally, I don't think their work is worthless. I think it's interesting knowing which institutions funded who. I do agree that there's a purpose behind that, and that plays an important role in the reproduction of the existing order, of course. And I think it's ambiguous. A lot of these people don't think that they're subjectively, they subjectively interpret themselves as actual communists and insightful thinkers that want to challenge capital at the level of ideas. And it's because of that tension that on one side, they can divert people, some people perhaps, away from a more substantial dissidence to the system. But on the other side, they also open up the possibility precisely of people going through them towards somewhere else. For me, I got to Parenti through Chomsky. You look up lectures online, you find Chomsky, and then somehow Parenti pops up, and you're like, wow, this is 10 times better. Would I have been able to get to Parenti without Chomsky? Who knows? Is Chomsky a left anti-communist, as Parenti said? He is. But there's this paradox where to get to Parenti, I needed to go through Chomsky. Now, that was my trajectory. I don't want to universalize that. But there seems to be a loss for that ambiguity that these thinkers play, where, yes, they have a social function as radical recuperators or whatever the fuck, but they also have at the very same time the opposite social function for a lot of thinkers. That's without even speaking about the fact that because their object of critique is very similar to ours as Marxist-Leninists, they could be tremendously insightful in a million different areas. And if you just perform this operation of canceling them because they don't politically or geopolitically align with you, because there's many things nationally that Zizek has been extremely insightful about. There's lessons that we apply to the ACP that now that I've been going back to Zizek, I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. That's where I think we both originally got stuff from. So, for instance, for me, like, how do you defend against the claim made by bourgeois philosophy and bourgeois ideologues in general in the 90s that we're in a post-ideological world because of the cynical distance that everyone has to official institutions? How do you defend that without Zizek's refocus towards practice and actions as the realm where ideology operates? That rereading of that famous quote from the first part of Marx's Capital, they know not what they do, but they do it anyways. Peter Sloterdijk, of course, adds, well, now today in the cynical age, they know what they do, but they do it anyways. But where was the ideological component? Was it in the knowing or in the lack of, or was it in the doing? It was always in the doing. It was always in the act that's structured through these hegemonic institutions. If you're not reading that, maybe you can get a little bit of that through Althusser, but even there, it's not as refined as you can get it with Zizek. And if you just cancel that because he helped to overthrow Yugoslavia, which I don't think he played that fucking an important of a role. He was a part of the people that overthrew it, but he wasn't singularly responsible or anything like that. If you just dismiss that, you end up with a very poor group of thinkers that are not attuned to how it is that ideology is working today.
Yeah, and I would say a few things with respect to people like Zizek. It's oftentimes that when someone, look, everything is interrelated, but there's absolutely a division of labor within mental labor. And what that means is that just because somebody has good geopolitics doesn't mean they have a good philosophy or a good theory, and vice versa. And oftentimes, actually, they're inversely proportional. Someone who has horrible or neutral or just uninteresting geopolitical views has an extremely brilliant insight when it comes to philosophy.
Mhm.
The case of Heidegger is you get a total opposite, right? He's part of the Nazi party, but at the same time, what he's doing for, if you want to call it philosophy or phenomenology or on top, which is really something he created in a way, or he inaugurated ontological thinking, right? As like a general, it was absolutely like a revolution in thought. It basically invented what we call continental philosophy. It's not necessarily people are always trying to like point out the relationship between the politics and his outlook, and well, how is it that he found these things rationally commensurable? And I think that's not an interesting line of inquiry, because politics and philosophy are not directly the same thing. Someone can have, because they're different spheres within this kind of total mental division of labor in a way, right? So that then there's that, and look, I'll go ahead and say it. I think Rockhill and his followers are extremely mediocre thinkers. They might have good scholarship in terms of their study of academia, but I don't think they're good philosophers. I don't think Rockhill has an adequate grasp of ontology and how to resolve the contemporary issues within Marxism. And make no mistake, there are definitely issues within contemporary Marxist theory that haven't been resolved. There's all sorts of things within Marxism that demand answers today. Like, what kind of world are we living in today? Marx didn't account for this. He didn't account for the possibility of this specific world emerging. What about the experience in the 20th century and 20th century communism? And I think it was Zizek's brutal self-awareness that there were no easy answers to this end that I did find very compelling about him. The fact that we haven't adequately reflected on the communist experience in the 20th century. And while I don't agree with his conclusions, I think he did leave a pretty wide open door open for people like you and I to actually explore that question with a higher degree of flexibility, sobriety, and honesty than the kind of just, I don't want to call them ideologists. I want to call them kind of psychotic, because they have a type of psychosis where it's like they're furries. They're living in a fantasy where they're LARPing, and they don't understand. Like Zizek's critique of ideology, I as you know, and we can get into this maybe, I object to the kind of notion of ideology, or that originates with Althusser. But I think what it is, it's a naive narrative realism. I like this notion of narrative realism, naive narrative realism, a kind of dialectical narrative realism, narrative nihilism, and so on and so on. Because I'm more interested in going back to Lacan and his notion of the signifier. I find this to be much more interesting. The signifier and the syntome. Lacan is famous for his Borromean knot, imaginary, symbolic, and real. But late Lacan discovers that in the signifier or the syntome, that is the actual constitutive element that unites the three rings. And actually, the tripart structure becomes superfluous if you really take it to its conclusion. It becomes, in a lot of ways, superfluous. I mean, in the beginning, it's necessary. Look, I don't want to ramble, but Lacan's tripart structure, a lot of people don't comprehend this. It's a chronology. He began with the imaginary. That's all he understood at first. He realized the inadequacy of, the mirror stage, which he was exploring, which actually comes from Sartre, right? And the existentialism. And that's actually like Lacan importing Heidegger's kind of phenomenological or ontological orientation at its purest through Sartre, through others, and so on. There's Kojève as well, and his master-slave dialectic of recognition. So Lacan fixates on the mirror stage first, right? And then there's this chronology in which he discovers And then finally, he realizes, well, actually, there's these three irreducible parts and components of what we call the constitution of the subject. And Lacan is interested in psychoanalysis. I'm not. I'm interested in a more fundamental understanding of how does consciousness develop? How does consciousness relate to theories, or what we call ideas, and narratives? What are narratives? How are they constitutive of our existence as human beings? What is the ontological dimension of that? Is it just a kind of pure transcendental horizon separated from material reality? Or are narratives and signifiers and symptoms, are these actually reality at its most raw and at its purest, in a way, right? I mean, it's Zizek who kind of draws out the ontological significance of Lacan in this way. Now, Zizek doesn't explore adequately whatsoever the most interesting aspect of Lacan's thinking, which is at the conclusion of his thinking, symptom, and this notion of how is a new signifier reproduced, right? The regrounding of the entire kind of tripart structure through a new signifier or symptom. He kind of takes a lot of that for granted. That it's precisely an inquiry into that made it effortless for me to leap right into Marxism-Leninism. And I could explain that further if necessary. But in any case, what Zizek did explore in drawing out the ontological significance that I found the most compelling from his thinking is that for Zizek, the structure of the subject is connected to something inherent in the real, if you will. And this is a kind of radical act. Something is radically at stake in our beliefs, in our convictions, in the nature of those beliefs and convictions, whether it's just a kind of circuit of producing jouissance and we're enjoying our position of failure and defeat, or whether it's like I was interested from Zizek in his kind of radical notion of authenticity. What does it actually mean to believe, right? What does it actually mean to be a communist? A lot of communists proclaim themselves to be revolutionaries and they have a revolutionary outlook, but there's all sorts of secret pathological ways in which they internalize their inadequacies, their failures, and as you pointed out, in the realm of doing, they're not communists. As a matter of fact, when they see ACP or they see real communist phenomena, they recoil from it in horror. There's something interesting about the way in which people can maintain a kind of ideological, if you want to call it that, or an imaginary attachment to these symbols and these ideas. But then when they kind of see, oh, no, actually it's real, there's a radical break. And it's almost like they reveal that all along they were never communists. So Zizek was exploring the question, how do we take the step from our kind of pathological symptom, our being stuck in ideology is his way of putting it. How do we take the radical step from being a pathological subject to being to a type of authenticity where we do actually there is a relationship between our convictions and the real. And Zizek, at his most fundamental, it culminates in this notion of the act for Zizek. And Zizek said that his favorite saying was the one by Napoleon: charge into battle first and then worry about the consequences later. Because the Zizekian act is basically a kind of irreducible, it's an irreducible act. And
it's Goethe's. It's Goethe's. In the beginning was the act.
Yeah.
Instead of the beginning was the word, in the beginning was the act.
Yeah. So the act is this kind of gesture, if you will, which engenders its own conditions of possibility. And so you kind of, it's like the subject is thrusted blindly into a position without any prior justification, without any copium, without any ideological narrative, without anything. And this breaks from a kind of existing horizon of conditions of possibility, I guess, in a Badusian sense, right? Although it's distinct from Badiou, of course, but you know, he uses this language, Zizek. And this is how novelty is possible for Zizek. Now, there are all sorts of ways in which I don't necessarily agree with that now, like looking back. But looking back, this was a very important intervention by Zizek to kind of draw out what does it mean to actually be an authentic revolutionary subject.
Friends, we live under a dictatorship of capital still, which means that in order to keep up the work that we're doing, we need financial contributions. There's many different ways in which you can help us financially. You can become a Patreon at patreon.com/MidwesternMarx. You can buy some of our books, which you can find at midwesternmarx.com/books. You can sign up for my classes and the other classes we offer with our Marxism school, which you can see at the Midwestern Marx selfie page. You can also support my work personally as a writer and everything else that I do through Substack at my Substack page, which is Philosophy in Crisis. In addition, if you want to support the American Communist Party financially, you can also donate to the party at acp.us. If you want to subscribe to the party's journal, which I am the chief editor of, you can do so at redamerica.acp.us. And if you can't support us financially at all, at least help us get our message out there. Share this program on your social media, share it with your friends and family and co-workers, and get it out as far and wide as possible. We thank you dearly. Can I just intervene there, because I want to rephrase some of what you're saying, because you said it very astutely in psychoanalytical language, but to put it in almost like layman's terms, throughout most of the history of Marxists, or at least in the West, especially in the West, they have taken the central question of ideology. In other words, why is it that people are not identifying with our ideas as communists, or back in the day as social democrats? Why is it that people whose fundamental interests, whose class interest is contrary to the dominant order and the ruling ideas, why are they identified with it? They have taken the problem always to be at the level of they have the wrong ideas. And in the sense, if one's aware of the distinction in how Plato and Aristotle think about ethics, for Plato, why does someone do something wrong? It's because they do not know that it is wrong. There's always a problem of ignorance at the level of thinking, such that if you teach them what is right, that's all that's required. For Aristotle, you have a much more refined understanding where someone can know what is right and still not do it. There's this gap that can exist between what a person thinks subjectively and their act. And I think that's part of what Zizek forces us to pay attention to. That's what's at stake here. If our conclusion, when we see working class people identifying with the ruling order, not rushing to join the Communist Party or something, is they're just stupid and they need education, we're never going to change anything, because that's not fundamentally the level at which it operates. It's something much more primordial, preconceptual in many ways, which is here, I think, for me, in recent months, where Heidegger has become very important, or to be even more specific, for me, it'd be Dreidegger, a mixture of a Hubert Dreyfus style reading of Heidegger, because there's this whole dimension of skillful coping in the world, of being in the world, that's not formally enumerated, that's not even able to be made conceptually clear per se in terms of outlining it in the form of rules, etc. But that's still a form of understanding and of skillfully being in the world. And one of the things that made that click, I don't remember if I told you about this or not, I was watching a podcast from Barry Bonds, Home Run King in the MLB. He doesn't do many podcasts, so I decided to put it on. And he was trying to describe the process of coaching. And there was something he was able to fundamentally understand when he was hitting. There's a curveball outside, fastball inside, that he was not able to put into words for the people that he was coaching. They just had to feel it through. They had to go through a change at a much more fundamental level than just listening to a rule that couldn't even be enumerated formally. And in that moment, I thought, well, some of the most educated working classes in history have been in Europe, in Germany, in France, in England. But the revolution happened, the most important revolution, I think, in human history happened in Russia and in China with basically illiterate peasants. So was it just this formal level of education and theory and the explicit ideas that people identify with, or was there something much deeper that was at stake or that is at stake in engaging in the class struggle and trying to initiate what you call revolutionary subjectivity in people, trying to activate that? It's much deeper than just this formal, very vulgar level of you have to have the right ideas. It's not about having the right ideas. It's much deeper than that. And if the Western left would have continued on that psychosis of just thinking about the ideas, it would have eternally repeated what we have today, which is a lot of these Western leftists, they call themselves one thing, they identify subjectively with one thing, but then when they experience it in the flesh, they shun from it. So I just want to emphasize this because I think there's something extremely practical, something very important is at stake here. And Zizek could be whatever he wants, but at least for me, I haven't found another individual that has been able to ask the question and to provide at least the beginning of a response, a horizon of where we should be looking at, as Zizek, I think, has been able to do.
So, yeah, and it's like most people, and I take this for granted because I'm so far gone on the crazy train, you know, but most people, they're living life on autopilot. There's an immense gravity and weight and authority that compels their activity, their movement. And you know, Lacan made an interesting point once, and this is why it's hard for me to understand, but it explains why people are sheep and NPCs in such a profound way. You know, for Lacan, the Aztecs did not sacrifice people because they wanted a gain. They wanted some extraordinary benefit. They did so because if they believed that if they stopped doing this, the sun would not rise in the morning, and there would be a natural calamity that would befall them. So just to keep the ordinary flow of things going, it was necessary to do this extraordinary thing. And that's how I think ideology works, and these kind of naive narrative realist structures of consciousness operate. I think people implicitly pay tithes to narratives, to an extraordinary kind of realism, which they think is necessary for the normal flow of life, right? And that's why when they see that we don't pay these tithes, or I don't pay these tithes, they project all these extraordinary things on us, not realizing that, hey, you can just kind of not do that. Everything will be fine, right? And with Zizek, what I found as a teenager, remember I'm a teenager here, what I found extremely like compelling and just so powerful from what he was saying and what he was writing was that if you kind of sum it up in his notion of the act, to break out of this habit of just blindly following and kind of disregarding the gravity and the weight of, whatever you want to call it, the ideological state apparatus, or, the kind of the big other or whatever, right? You have to engage in this act like a bird, being pushed out of the nest, so to speak. And the key thing is that there's no prior guarantee of how that will be resolved. You don't first discover a principle or an idea and then preempt your action and say, well, when I do this act, when I engage in this action, whatever the action happens, it could be something so small. It could be if you're in high school, you know, for some people, maybe it's as radical as this. Maybe they're just going to quit their stupid Democrat club or something. They're going to break out of some kind of habit whose sole function is to reinforce their ideological attachment to the status quo, right? But in any case, you do this, and
the reasons come after the fact.
The reasons come after the fact, but additionally, it's not like you can preempt it and say, okay, I have such a certainty in this theory or this idea that I know the outcome of my actions. There has to be a radical doubt, a radical anxiety that you don't know what it's going to actually happen. And you know, by the way, that's what praxis means. Let's remember, what is the relation of theory to practice if we're materialists? It's the practice that comes first. If the theory could preempt the outcome of practice, what's the fucking point of practice? That's not practice. That's just blindly fulfilling an idea by other means. That's all it is. And by the way, that's how leftists get on with life. They're conformists, they're NPCs. Their form of ideology is either voting for Democrats, or as we see them behave online, they kind of instinctually side with groypers and fascists and whatever, and like they're not even realizing what they're doing. Right? It's natural, it's normal to them. It's supposed to be unspoken, it's implicit. There's all of these ways they radically conform to the status quo, while simultaneously maintaining these ideological pretenses in their head. And what they're saying is, when the conditions are ripe, when things turn out in the right way, that's when we'll have a revolution. That's when we'll have communism. But until then, until reality meets these ideal conditions, hey, what can you say? I'm not responsible. And as a teenager, mind you, as a teenager, I don't mean to get too loud, wake up the neighbors. As a teenager, I found this radically compelling. And it's Zizek's text, like repeating Lenin, where he's talking about this was the essence of the Leninist position, that no, we're not going to wait for conditions to get ripe. We're not going to like wait for the ideal conditions to be met. You have to have, in order to be faithful to a principle. And this is something I'm working on, is that what is principle? You know, principle, because principle is more than ideal to me. Principle, in any case, to be faithful to a principle, or what most people would call an idea, there needs to be this radical risk you take, that your first act in the only inspiration you have, you no longer have this authority, you no longer have this big other. So what do you have when you fall into an act, so to speak, right? Zizek, and I don't want to be cringe, but this is what Zizek describes like falling in love, right? He actually says this is the same thing in terms of the structure.
He's taken a lot of that from Badiou's thinking about the love encounter and the element of risk.
Yeah, and the event and the different types of events and stuff, right? But the falling into a revolutionary act or revolutionary disposition, it's literally a fall, right? What are you falling into? Because the gravity and the weight of the big other is gone, right? And in order to actually just begin the possibility of establishing a relationship between your actions, and I mean that in the most naive colloquial sense, and your principles, you have to fail first. Mm-hmm. Only when you begin the act can you then, even out of the failure, say, okay, I failed, but now, you know, I can actually measure and relate my principles to my actions. Like, now the possibility of praxis has begun. I've taken the first step. In the first step, I've fallen and I've stumbled over, but I've fallen out of a cage. That's the key thing. I've fallen out of an ideological prison that binds me to the status quo, that binds me to pre-existing authorities and powers. And it's this from Zizek as a teenager that I considered like no other thinker laid it out this clearly, you know, and it was so compelling to me because absolutely, you know, we create these ideological cope bubbles to neglect and neglect the responsibility we have to be responsible for the relationship between our principles and our actions. And most people say, well, I live in capitalism, there's nothing I can do about it. That's a fucking excuse. Because, you know, most conservatives say, well, why do you have an iPhone or whatever? And it's like, there's kind of a grain of truth to that. Not if you take it literally, but if you take it in the sense of like, so why the fuck are you sitting around and complaining? Fucking do something about it. And look at what we've done. People think that some big other is responsible for the ACP. They say Russia's responsible. They say we're getting money from God knows where. Some will even try to Fed jacket us and say we're feds. But the God honest truth is that we've done what you considered impossible for pathological reasons. You are like the Aztecs, engaging in constant rituals of human sacrifice to maintain your sense of normalcy. All we did is stop doing that. All we did is realize, hey, you know what? You can just do this and it will be fine. And it's this kind of suspension of the most, you know, every time I see a new leftist collective form, they cannot stop addressing the big other. They start with a manifesto, and the first thing they're going to do is what? They're going to immediately kind of wrestle with what they think they're going to be perceived as, what expectations they're going to fulfill or not going to fulfill. They're going to immediately kind of, you know, tear down the big other. Well, this is because of the U.S. is evil and whatever and yada, yada, yada. And it's almost like they're yearning and crying for recognition and validation. That's what they want. They're like babies crying for the big other to come and nurture them and pick them up and tell them it's all going to be okay. And this is true for pretty much 99% of the U.S. left. It's a cry for attention. It's a cry for, hey, you know what? You disappointed me. You know, the master disappointed me. And they're hysterically mounting this kind of challenge to the master. Hey, fix it. You fucked it up. Fix it. Like they can't get over it. They can't just say it's past us and that there needs to be a new dimension of responsibility for what authority we answer to that is opened up. So the ACP, what was our declaration? Our declaration was like legalistic. We're talking about the history of the CPUSA. There's no emotion, there's no whatever. And it's like, that's our tradition and that's our authority. The history of the Communist Party. And we're responsible for it, and it's ours. And we don't need to engage in this kind of melodrama with the big other, because we know that actually you can exist in reality, you can avoid psychosis, you can maintain a kind of normalcy without the ideological rubbish and garbage of the bourgeois hegemony. You don't need Avatar. You don't need these teddy bears. That's what I call them on my stream, teddy bears, right? You don't need them. You don't need a teddy bear to go to sleep at night without monsters under your bed. You can just sleep. Now, it's kind of that Zizek would kind of object to that reasoning, you know, like, well, that's kind of a naive notion that you can somehow escape ideology and so on. And it's like, well, I'm not saying you can escape narratives, but you can absolutely establish an authentic relationship between the narrative, the real, and your place in that. Anyway.
Yeah, there's a few things you said there that I think when I was rereading Zizek, I was able to see the points where some of the ideas that I think have been most important for me to develop were kind of inspired by both Zizek, but specifically a Zizek or Zizekian reading of Hegel. I think the importance of failure, of taking that risk and failing. I mean, it's a constitutive component of success. There's this very like almost amateur-ish bodybuilding philosophy thing that you get from various different bodybuilders, where they talk about. I'm thinking I have one in mind, and I can't remember his name. Someone's probably gonna catch it. The blonde one that had the massive legs. But he said it very explicitly, like you have to get to failure in order to get success. You have to get failure, and it seems like kind of like street philosophy, pop philosophy stuff, but it's absolutely true. And
Absolutely.
when it comes to like these leftists, it was paradoxical in the sense that on the one side they're scared to take the radical risk of the act because it could lead to failure, because it could lead to being ostracized from the big other, etc. But at the same time, like when they looked abroad, their favorite projects are the ones that failed and collapsed completely. And I think there's a connection to that because our favorite projects did go through failures and did have mistakes, but they kept going. They had the possibility to keep going. So we were able to draw lessons as to how important failure is as a component to success and to the process of revolutionary struggle. But for a lot of these people, it ends in failure. Those are their favorite projects, the ones that just collapsed but had a very pure first few months or first few years. Chile's Allende or Sankara or all of these projects that, they were cool while they lasted, but they failed and their failure was the end. And that's it. They didn't have to deal with the day after the failure. How the fuck do you recoup?
They didn't have to deal with responsibility.
Exactly. That's the big thing. And that's why a lot of these people, they'll call themselves Marxist Leninists. They'll put symbols on their bios on X or whatever the fuck. But in many ways, in the form of carrying things out, that authentic conservative that Zizek talks about, that's willing to commit to the consequences of their action and take responsibility, is much closer to the modus operandi of a Marxist Leninist than any of these leftists are, who are literal, they're rooted in liberal irresponsibility, a lack of commitment for the actions and the consequences thereof, because they operate at the realm of the ideal. And as soon as things get messy, they back up and it's like, well, I don't want to do this anymore. I don't want to be held responsible because it broke with how I envisioned it in my head. And the spirit of my critique of the purity fetish was precisely that. Like for most of the left, the MAGA working class were too dirty. Why would you engage in that? That's setting you up for failure. Why would you even try MAGA communism as a speculative project? It's going to fail and burn. Why try it? Why take that leap of jumping out of the pre-existing political fucking diagram, whatever it's called, the four little boxes? Why take the leap of trying to break out of the dominant paradigm in which the ruling institutions are able to capture, well, who's authoritarian right, libertarian right, authoritarian? Why take that leap? Why take that risk? It's gonna lead you to failure. So yeah, I don't know. I'm interested in hearing uh how do you get to Heidegger? Because I know for me, I spoke a little bit of this just now. I remember seeing the post, the article that you did, Why Marxism was Not Woke, and I was very Lukács-pilled at the time. And I was like, Heidegger is a rationalism that leads to postmodernism and gender theory and Butler, and that's wokeism par excellence. That was my reaction at the moment. And it wasn't until maybe a few months ago where I went back to reading Heidegger specifically through the sources that I had originally read it through, which was Hubert Dreyfus's book, Being in the World. And that's when it all clicked because it emphasized this dimension of like just being in the world that cannot be reduced to formal thought. But how did you get to Heidegger?
Well, um, I wanted to say one other thing really
Yeah,
quick.
yeah, go ahead.
The thing about practice and failure is that it's the same way AI works. In the beginning, it's garbage, but it has to fail in order
Yeah,
to eventually get it right, right? Because that's what creates the kind of relationship in the first place that makes success possible. The relationship has to begin as failure. It can't begin with success. It's a 1 in a million chance. Anyway, regarding the question of Heidegger, um, Oftentimes, intellectuals, I guess, I don't know what to call it, will base their reasoning off of like post hoc, right? Like based on how it fits in their existing view. And I want to avoid that here in terms of like, how did I go from Zizek to just recognizing actually Heidegger's first step? I eventually came to a conclusion through Zizek, especially through Badiou and others who I thought were especially wrong, right? I thought Zizek brought things to their radical limit when it comes to philosophy in the 21st century. Like, he was not coping in ways that they were coping, basically, right? And I by the way, I think Zizek's polemics and critiques of the kind of neo-Spinozis, Badiou, and others, it's unmatched. Like it's not just unmatched, it's unanswered. Nobody's answered it. He's just been dismissed by like Rockhill as a Fed, or he's a crazy guy, but nobody's actually responded to his critiques. So he has left like the final page in the development of, you know, this specific line of this school of thought, right? That maybe begins with Heidegger, right? But at the end of the day, the post-Heideggerians were all interested in restoring the integrity of philosophy. After Heidegger, they were interested in restoring the integrity of philosophy specifically as the highest and most fundamental way in which we can relate to being. And that's kind of something Heidegger precisely debases, like at the outset. And, you know, Badiou, his kind of Neoplatonism seeks to fulfill this. It's a Neoplatonism or whatever, right? But it's specifically a Platonism that is developed in response to Heidegger. And Zizek is the most brilliant of all in ways, because he takes the kind of Lacanian subject, which is internally split and decentered and so on and so on. It's the subject of object A, right? And it's not a fully constituted ideal subject. It's a subject, you know, that can be described with terms like lack or excess or incompleteness and so on, or an object, if you will, right? His understanding of the real, that reality is ontologically incomplete. And out of this imminent negativity, right, this negation, there Zizek rediscovers or attempts to rediscover the originary kind of sanction of the privileging of thought in the form of ideas. And he makes this leap without any kind of mediation. And this is kind of my critique of Zizek simplified. He concludes, let's just say, with any number of his kind of ontological conclusions, like reality is ontologically incomplete, right? So there's an imminent negation there that's implied by that in his notion of being and reality. And he goes from there to the idea right away with no mediation. Like the negativity that grounds thought, that's the subject, okay? The subject is this kind of self-relating negativity. That's Lacan, Freud's death drive, and so on and so on. The Cartesian subject, the self-relating negativity. And how that is, how that can be kind of, what's the right word? How that can be kind of articulated within a framework of an ontology, right? Zizek very comprehensively he is an extremely comprehensive thinker, right? His ontology is it's a very thorough way in which he kind of articulates how does a subject emerge out of the real, right, if you will, out of the how being itself is. But if you go to any number of these conclusions that you can look at it from, right? What do I mean by that? Like if you take any number of possible conclusions you could draw from that, depending on how you look at it, he rediscovers the kind of the substance of thought. What is a thought, right? Like square one. Okay, so this is the negativity of the subject. So Therefore, right, a thought is this kind of it's a kind of activity of this subject. It's a kind of expression of this subject. So this is how you re-enter this kind of kingdom of idealism that Marx so thoroughly critiqued Hegel and the young Hegelians for dwelling within, right? Zizek found a way through materialism, in his own words, to rediscover that. And it's kind of his whole shtick, right? To rediscover the basic justification for the Hegelian idealism.
Do you think that flows from the critiques of Heidegger that he carries out?
Yes, precisely. Because for Zizek, Heidegger... Zizek was trying to take Heidegger and go full circle, basically. Articulate a justification. And Lacan, to be fair, which was more ambiguous and more interesting than Zizek. And Zizek takes many unwarranted liberties with Lacan's notion of the Cartesian subject. Why? Because what did Lacan say? He said, I think where I am not, and I am where I do not think. And that is how Lacan rehabilitates the Cartesian subject, as an immanent negativity or incompleteness within the real, right? Or a blind spot of some kind, an indetermination. Now, there's a way to salvage that from the point of dialectical materialism. I think Lacan was a dialectical materialist, and he said he was, right? So you could salvage that, but Zizek takes too much liberties with the Cartesian subject. Because I need to rewind and talk about Heidegger again. Because what Lacan was responding to Heidegger was that Heidegger wanted to debase the privileged significance of the Cartesian subject as kind of, well, this is like this treats being as a being. This is not a fundamental horizon of being, right? This is a specific disclosure of being according to a kind of specific frame, right? And well, Lacan calls into question the truism of philosophy since Parmenides, right? I'm saying it right, which is that how do I say it?
Parmenides. Yeah.
Parmenides.
Close enough.
Which is the identity of thought and being. That being, what is it? Language is the house of being, and that being and thinking are the same. And by the way, Heidegger did not break from this view, right? But Lacan actually returns to Descartes by violating this basic assumption, or calling into question this basic assumption. And then finally, Zizek basically, if I have to radically simplify his critique of Heidegger, Zizek basically is trying to say that the ontological distinction Heidegger points out is itself inherent in being. That there's something about the nature of being that is responsible for the very distinction Heidegger, talks about, being capital B and being small b, right? And that this is not a mistake of subjectivity. This is actually how the real, this is the basic Hegelian displacement, right? Taking the thing that is the terms of the contradiction between the subject and the object and placing that back into the object, right? So this is kind of Zizek's critique of Heidegger. And then from there, like from this understanding of the difference within the real, that being is split, it's split within, and so on and so on. This is how Zizek then justifies philosophy. It is his book, Sex and the Failed Absolute. It's absolutely about this. But in this way, Zizek, he does almost what Hegel does at the end of his life. Zizek then justifies philosophy as the kind of most authentic, most radically authentic relationship a subject can have to the real. That in this way, the cause of the philosophy and the product of the philosophy come together, right? And they're made harmonious and concordant with one another. This is how Zizek resolves everything. He regrounds the very thing you said would happen.
I told you it would.
Edit that out. You have to edit that out. That's blasphemy. That's fucking sacrilege. Anyway,
if I can just intervene,
yeah.
this is in part why in the Lenin book you referenced, what's his lesson? Even though the importance of the act, all of that, but what's the lesson? For too long, I think this is an explicit quote from it. For too long, we have interpreted Marx's 11th thesis. Um, uh,
Yeah.
Philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. For too long, we have focused on changing and change it. Now it's time to think. That's
Hmm.
what he concludes. He's like, we have to go
Right.
back and just think.
Yeah. And I think exactly. And then but in his philosophy, he finalizes this. I think he does this. I would say where it convinced me that he does this is in Sex and the Failed Absolute. Like finally, like before, there's some ambiguity where he's going with it, but then he kind of explicitly adopts a scholastic orientation in this book, like literally modeled off of like medieval scholasticism, and just like how Hegel, I think, ended his philosophy with a false reconciliation, which is the philosophy of right. I think Zizek does the exact same thing. It's a false reconciliation between, between being and thinking, so to speak, or between, the ontologically incomplete reality and the content of subjectivity or whatever. Like he resolves this into I think he makes an unjustifiable leap. I think there's something missing there between the leap from his kind of notion of the ontological incompleteness of reality, so to speak. I mean, to simplify it, and this precise gap and space out of which the ideality, right, beginning with Plato, emerges. No, there's a fire from Heraclitus that's there that Zizek totally skips over. And that fire can give rise to other determinations other than ideas. And so this is where, for me, Stalinism via Boris GROYS and the notion of the dialectic of content and form became instantaneously. I didn't need to be won over by Grover Furr. I was already familiar with Grover Furr. I was won over by this a materialist critique of Zizek's conclusion is what led me to Marxism-Leninism. Because then it became instantly clear that there's a more fundamental kind of praxis in the form of the party organization, in the form of state governance, in the form of statesmanship, and the logic of the proletarian dictatorship. And this experience, which, while not a philosophy, while not conforming to an ideal, is itself its own kind of language. It's not the language of pure thought and pure thinking, but it has determination, it has structure, it has form. And it's specifically how Boris GROYS points out how from the Soviet avant-garde, you get socialist realism. And then it was my aha moment. The high point of the Soviet avant-garde, which is kind of pure modernism, pure kind of Zizekian veneration of the self-negating negativity of the subject, self-relating negativity of the subject, and so on and so on. When we draw out the reconciliation of that, I write about this in one of my submissions when I talk about Kojev and how the self-relation of the universal and homogeneous state, that's what creates the civilization state Dugin talks about, or Zhang Weiwei does, right? But in any case, from this move, you get determination. For Zizek, determination equals ideality. That is a wrong assumption. Determination doesn't have to be an idea. A determination out of this kind of fire of Heraclitus, if you will, right, doesn't have to be the Platonic idea. It can also be a more fundamental kind of structure, or something recent I like to call a resonance, right, of the material real, of the symptom. And how we name these things, that's the signifier. Like, our first way of naming that is the signifier, right? And then it's like, but once you name that, all the determinations and all of the symptoms across the entire fabric of our social reality and history, and this is what was brilliant I got from Boris GROYS, all of that suddenly becomes part of one order. And it was brilliant how Boris GROYS described in the movement from the Soviet avant-garde to socialist realism, that is how the Soviet ideologists under Stalin, that's how they were able to establish a newfound relationship to the past. And before, I thought Stalinism was just a return to vulgar Russian nationalism, and it was, it was the end of the interesting revolutionary thing. But it's Boris GROYS who points out, no, it was a radical reinterpretation of the Russian national existence and the Russian national past. That it's like a reconciliation where the determinations of the national forms throughout Russian history, Alexander Nevsky, Ivan Grozny, and the various symbolisms and cultural artifacts of Russian civilization, these no longer have to be associated with Tsarism or petty Russian nationalism, because the actual process out of which they acquire real material determination can now be understood, because the same thing happened in the revolutionary experience. Socialism in one country is a way to rediscover how do civilizations acquire determinate forms. What do these actually mean, right? So there was this kind of new... It was like a Rosetta Stone, basically, to radically reassimilate the entire Russian national past. And this radical density of Stalinism, Marxism, Leninism, which you find in China as well today, especially today with Xi Jinping, but even under Mao, that has not been explored in Western thinking. And I think you need to go through Zizek and Heidegger and so on to get it. And that's why I begin with infrared. I'll let you go in a sec. To understand Marxism, Leninism in the West, we need Heidegger, because we need to disentangle ourselves from this specific horizon of being, which prevents us to understand the crucial moment of reconciliation from high Soviet revolutionary fervor, avant-garde, to socialism in one country. What actually happened there? And that is the key to understanding. And that retroactively, by the way, makes sense of Lenin and what Lenin did. Lenin was not just some kind of... If you read Repeating Lenin, which is a great text, Zizek kind of would make it out to seem like Lenin was just this risk taker. No, Lenin... Yeah. Finally, I'll just say this. Stalin was the most faithful student of Lenin, because this is what Lenin does with his revolutionary strategy, which was absolutely a radical resignation compared to European social democracy, because he understands how, out of the Heraclitean flux of the Russian peasantry, determinations relevant for modern civilization are emerging. And it's precisely this movement that Lenin himself brilliantly institutionalizes, so to speak, in the very form of the Bolshevik Party. But please go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to make a statement because I think the light in which you're presenting Stalin is as a civilizational thinker, as a thinker that sheds light on the civilizational dimension in Marxism. That's a genuine contribution. And what better area to see that than his polemics on linguistic? It's a fundamental, I think, contribution that you have there, where it's like, is it the superstructure? No. Is it the base? No. It's something almost much more fundamental. And I think in retrospect, we can see that part of what he was pointing out was this deeper civilizational reality that can take a wide variety of different forms.
Dugin.
Well, I haven't read my Dugin, but if that's what's in Dugin,
according to the Western perceptions of Dugin, is this scary particularist. It's Stalin who was the first Duginist, if in that sense, precisely because of the book you just, the writing you just, his intervention in the question of linguistics. Because what does that actually mean if language is not a superstructure? That means there is no universal base, so to speak, which determines language. That means there's no universal formula for the linear development of mankind. That means that each civilization, with all the diversity of languages that exist, represent distinct modes of production. Because for Stalin, a language is more like a mode of production. A means of production. But it's not just a means of production because it's like this radical base, you know?
Even deeper.
It's even deeper than a
primordial.
base. Yeah, it's even deeper than a base. And it's something that is trans-historical in the Marxist sense. It radically transcends modes of production. If there is any kind of, like you said, civilizational framework that transcends mode of productions, hey, we're in Dugin's ballpark here, you know? You don't have to agree with everything Dugin says, but like that's the ballpark he's working with, more or less.
You know what? Stalin is demonized for the whole 5-stage things. You look at the left, and I did some translation work early on for Alvaro Garcia Linera, and one of the things he's critical of Stalin and the Second International and Trotsky is the schematized 5 stages that every society goes to, and without any attention to particular context and all that stuff. But it's in Stalin precisely that any Marxist that wants to be attuned to civilizational particularities of a people, that's where it's at. That's the first thinker that pays very explicit attention to this deep. Now, of course, he's not pulling from anywhere. I think this is all implied in the classics of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, but the first person to shed light on this in a very explicit way that gives us tools for thinking about this deeper dimension of a civilizational reality, civilizational Dasein, if you wish, that a people have that that sustains throughout the different particular modes of production that it goes through, is Stalin. I wanted to pull out here. It could be the last point we make regarding Heidegger. But in one of the articles that Zizek does critiquing Heidegger, the Hegel versus Heidegger one, he makes a very interesting statement that Heidegger is good for neurotics, but not for psychotics, because neurotics they're torn, but they still operate within the symbolic order, and psychotics are the ones that break with the symbolic order, that actually have the capacity to take that act that goes beyond. And Heidegger does not account that. And I was expecting, as I was reading the article, which was, I think, the first time I encountered Zizek's critique of Heidegger, for this to be a refinement of that framework, you know? And it ended up just turning back towards the subject, which I didn't appreciate. I know we talked about this a little bit through DM before, but I still like the turn away from the notion, the Cartesian notion of the subject. I like Dasein as a way of thinking about the human being. But Dugin, the third very problematic thinker, is that just what you take from Dugin, that understanding of civilizational Dasein and existence?
No, I think Dugin's idea of logos is the step in the right direction. It's idealistic, especially how he draws it out, but structurally, it's the right step. And what I mean by that is that the particularization of Dasein, turning Dasein into a kind of object capable of self-relation and determination and so on and so on. I think things get very interesting there, because what we're basically doing, more or less, is we are allowing modes of production to be turned into objects. A mode of production understood not as this kind of transcendental totality that's always out of frame, but something that actually is like has like an objectal status and can be defined, you know, not defined necessarily like in a textualist sense, but defined in a kind of sense of what principles govern the mode of production. What is the underlying logic of a mode of production? The logos, right? And how does that reproduce um, what we would call a Dasein, right? Um, we're tempted to say subject, right? But of course, that's one-sided. So Dugin is a very brilliant thinker. Even if you don't agree with his conclusions, which I don't, because he is very interested in understanding, you know, what makes a people, and he doesn't explore this question in a directly metaphysical way. And what I mean by that, he doesn't care to entertain notions of the real racists today are the ones who are kind of trying to be scientific about it. Like, what makes a people is that they have a biological selection of DNA. Dugin doesn't give a fuck about any of that. And this is the creepy shit. That's the real white nationalism or whatever. You ask a white nationalist, what makes your race a race? They'll be like, well, it's my haplogroup and my DNA, like some other kind of fucking nonsense, right? So it's Philistinism. And then he also won't simply be interested in saying it's the ideas, it's the values, in terms of like, well, it's like Joe Biden says, well, America is defined by this value, this idea, right? Dugin, kind of like Zizek, is getting in the nitty gritty of like the formation of subjectivities, for lack of a better term. It's an intensely psychological dimension, if you will, that he's exploring, which he absolutely gives expression to through various kind of poetic devices, which I like. I just fuck with his writing style big time. And, a kind of mysticism for sure to produce this kind of, you almost need a kind of altered state of consciousness, getting outside of the box of, this strict rationalism of Cartesian rationalism, if you will, right?
The angle
And
bomb.
in this kind of psychedelic reality, things get very interesting, and they have determination. It's not just a bunch of jumbled nonsense. There's patterns, and they make sense, right? There's like a deeper rationality to how he describes these things. And he draws from, the entire canon of Western esoteric literature. He's drawing from ancient studies in mythology and anthropology and so on and so on. He's kind of putting all of these together in ways that attempt to kind of derive and get to the essence and the substance of like what makes a people. How are people's values? How can we define these values? What are these values, right? And some people may see metaphysical gibberish. What I see is an extremely interesting presentation of distinct dialectical relationships and determinations. Like in his understanding of the West or Europe, he says, well, this is a relationship of Apollo, Dionysus, and Sibyl, the tripart, whatever structure. And it's like, you don't have to take that literally, though. You can actually derive a dialectical logic he's trying to describe, between, for example, European rationalism, this kind of more ecstatic side of death drive or whatever, right? And then, in the case of Sybil, this specific. I mean, if you really thought about these things, these conceptual devices that Dugin invents, and you think about them thoroughly enough, you could really get you could map this onto a very meticulous, like, understanding of the mode of production. Some people are content with the enigma of the commodity form. But there's a lot. It doesn't end there, basically. There's more forms than the commodity form, so to speak. In fact, the commodity form has more determination than it lets on. It's not simply a substanceless universal form or whatever. This is how it is according to a very strict legal framework of universal equality. That was the ideal of the French Revolution. The ideal was never fulfilled. Let's remember that. So when Marx talks about the commodity form, and he's talking about capital in the abstract, he is talking about an abstraction. Because these are all embedded in a much more determinate kind of form, right? Much more determinate patterns of civilization. The one that is pure and excised of all of that rubbish, medieval rubbish or whatever, that was the ideal of the French Revolution. Many people presume that the ideal of bourgeois equality and formalism would prevail totally and absolutely. That's what Alexander Kojev said, the same thing with his notion of the universal and homogeneous state. But in actual fact, that was just an ideal. The universal and homogeneous state today is the American Empire. And is this truly a universal and homogeneous state? No, it's precisely
Heterogeneous.
heterogeneous. Heterogeneity reemerges in the conflict zones. This is what I talk about in my article. So we have to go to war and fight against these partisan guerrillas. They are the ones giving determination to this state of ours, right? And today with the Trumpism, you know, the Americanism is being defined in like a white nationalist, you know, I don't know, European nationalist framework of like, well, we're just the white people, I guess. We're a specific race after all. So, and that's a natural outcome of the abstraction of liberalism. And then you see China and Russia, who also have this kind of universalism, but they explicitly acknowledge the formal determination that arises from understanding the self-relation of the universal, right? Of the universal and homogeneous state. Insofar as it itself affects itself as its own object, determination reemerges, particularity reemerges in a way that is not nihilistic, as in the case of the U.S. Empire.
It understands universals through a concrete light.
And that enables the possibility of recognition.
Yeah.
Russia can recognize different ethnicities and peoples within its civilizational state. The same is true for China, because the framework for recognition, self-recognition, is there, and therefore the possibility of recognizing others.
Yeah, what's interesting, there's a statement that Zizek makes in one of his movies, I think, A Pervert's Guide to Ideology, that one of the interesting things about this attempt at always achieving this universal or formulating it, and I think he's referring to an abstract universal, but is that there's always another that's outside, that's not invited, that's not included. I think that's par excellence, the logic of bourgeois philosophy and of bourgeois universalism. I want to ask one more philosophy related question, because we've been at it for quite a while now. One of the other enigmas, I think, when I encountered you and your thought was French theory, and how you draw from French theory. And this is, of course, another area where those sympathetic with Rockhill are not happy, because all of that just gets tossed out. And for me, it was the ways in which that was a precondition for like a lot of Judith Butler and a bunch of gender theory bullshit. But what do you draw from French theory proper?
I draw from Alexander Kojev and all his descendants. And I draw from, well, I mean, it depends on how you look at that, because some of the descent is indirect. But, you know, there's a line from Kojev to Bataille and then to Lacan.
Mhm.
And then that same line through Lacan, let's say, goes through Deleuze. And all these kind of thinkers cross-pollinate, Lyotard, and even Derrida, I think, is an interesting thinker. And Baudrillard, how do I say his name?
Baudrillard, yeah.
Baudrillard. I think these are the most brilliant thinkers the West produced in the 20th century. Among them, you know, I think among Western Marxists, and I just mean this in a geographical sense, the preeminent thinker to me is Antonio Gramsci, who is unrivaled, you know. The rest are garbage to me. Like Lukács is the beginning of the end, right? And if you know, the choice is not even Heidegger versus Lukács. I think it's kind of Gramsci versus Lukács in a lot of ways. And I think it's interesting because Italy was if there's any country in the West that could have gone communist, it was Italy, right?
Yeah,
and it's not a coincidence. Gramsci was such a brilliant thinker. He came from a country that had a brilliance of possibility when it came to going communist, both in the post-war period and before.
What's interesting was when I first encountered uh, your stuff on Heidegger, I had just finished reading Lucian Goldman's book on Lukács and Heidegger, where he makes the argument that basically some of the central ideas in Heidegger were knockoffs from Lukács. And I couldn't make sense of how is it that Haas on one hand is attacking Lukács and upholding Heidegger. What's going on here?
And when people are very puzzled when I talk about Heidegger, but they don't understand my implicit chronologization of thinkers within the history of thought. Heidegger is an important stepping stone. I'm already assuming Kojève is correct in his departure from Heidegger. I'm assuming Lacan is correct in his and it culminating maybe in Zizek or something, right? Like, I'm just talking about where you're missing, not you, but like Western leftists. Like, you haven't gone through the Heidegger pill. And they're like, well, I want to retain my revolutionary outlook. I want to retain my Marxism. And it's like, don't worry, you'll retain it. Go through the Heidegger
Almost
thing.
like a video game where there's like maps that they haven't gone through, that they should go through.
Yes, and they're worried, but they're worried because they think they're going to lose something.
Yeah.
And it's like, you're not going to lose it because you haven't gained it in the first place. That's why we don't have time to talk about it, but when I was talking about the notion of the revolutionary spark, that's the faith they lack. They don't believe in a fundamental revolutionary spark. You know what? I'll go through Heidegger. I'll go through the Ayatollah. I'll go through literally every mystical, whatever gibberish thinker you want. And I still believe that I'll be on the right path. I'm not scared to be tempted by other ideas because my convictions and my revolutionary outlook comes from something more fundamental than an idol. I don't have an idol. The idol is not an idea. It's not an ideal. It's not a thought. I don't have an idol. I am a Marxist because I have a continuous and present reproduction and reaffirmation of a more fundamental revolutionary outlook. And if you don't have faith in the revolutionary spark within you, you can't be a Marxist in the first place. Look at the Kotskys and the Bernsteins and others. Oh, they were great Marxists, quote unquote. And why is it that Lenin had to radically break with them in the way that he did, so violently and so abruptly? Because Lenin had what they didn't. He had the same intensity of the revolutionary spark that Marx and Engels had that had been forgotten by all Marxists during his time. All of them. Even Rosa Luxemburg, may she rest in peace. But even Rosa Luxemburg didn't fully get it. Lenin had this intensity, this intensity and acuity of comprehension of the same kind of subjective compelling factors that drove Marx and Engels to every conclusion that they did, to every path that they took. The rest forgot about that, right? So it's like, people should not fear they're going to lose their revolutionary convictions by taking hard pills that contradict the superficial form of those convictions. Because the superficial attachment, the wrong ways you're articulating revolutionary consciousness, in practice correspond to zero results.
Yeah.
Inadequacy, ineffectiveness, and failure. So these risks need to be taken. If I tell you, you need to accept Heidegger was correct. And you know what actually brought me to Heidegger? Because I didn't actually even talk about that. It was my rereading of Marx after my dissatisfaction with Hegel, with Zizek's reconciliation. I wanted to go back to Marx and understand what was Marx's critique of Hegel, because Zizek presents us a rendering of this critique, which is false. Marx wasn't an empiricist. He wasn't a naive realist or whatever. That the substance of his critique wasn't, let's stop philosophizing and just return to naive reality. There's a specific procedure Marx pulls. Jesus Christ. I'm going to get killed or by a ghost or something. There's a specific procedure that Marx engages in from Hegel to Marx, right, his position, which has something to do with Hegel's dialectical logic being the entire meaningfulness of the entire enterprise of Hegelian thinking and the entire system acquires concreteness for Marx in a specific way, such that the real essential concrete thing was under our noses the entire time. And it was always there, this kind of always there-ness that you kind of get in Lacan, actually, with his notion of subjective destitution, right? But this is the move pulled by Marx. It's a very radical thing. Like, man as the highest essence for man means the entire brilliance of the Hegelian system is it's an attribute of the material being of man. And this is a return to being, to thinking about being in the first place, before ideality, before ideas. So this is a kind of primordial orientation Marx initiates in his notion of species being. And to me, that should be cross-referenced with Heidegger. Almost in the same. Now, where Heidegger doesn't return to a being, Marx does. But who is Marx's being? Marx's being is man. But what is man? Man is the thing that reconciles the entire procedure and process of thought in the first place. So man for Marx is not a zoological being. It's not a anatomical, physical being necessarily. More fundamentally for Marx, man is the determination of something that initially appears solely suspended in thought. And for Marx, this is actually our thoughts, however dialectical and whatever profound, these are a reflection of something already here in the real. And this is what we're merely this is what we're giving expression to. So for example, when Zizek says reality is ontologically incomplete, what does that actually mean? It means our thoughts, that there is this is my way of critiquing Zizek from Marx. It's not that reality is ontologically incomplete. It's that our specific horizon of reality via thought is necessarily incomplete with respect to its own material essence. Going back to Lacan's rendition of Descartes, I think where I am not, and I am where I do not think. That's what's responsible for the kind of appearance of an incompleteness, because we're suspended dialectically in a material reality that and that cannot be conditioned by thought, by the terms and conditions of how it's reflected in our thinking. And who precisely was the thinker in the 20th century who emphasized that fact the strongest, even on a stereotypical level? It was Heidegger. We're thrown into it before we can think about it. And my interpretation of Heidegger, or my response to him, if you will, is that thought can never give totality to our being. Part of our being is always obscured to it, because the thought itself is part of it. So the totality, the whole, if you will, right? By the time that we render all of that into thought and reflect it, there's a new totality, right? It's almost, actually, at the time I was on this line of inquiry, it's like a final thing. I was even exploring the question of, really stupid question, but I haven't heard a compelling response to it. It's like, what if the paradox of the Big Bang is precisely that every time we try to measure a starting point, we expend time. And after having expended that time as an observer to discover the starting point, we have drifted away from it. So there's no starting point. Or maybe a starting point is a kind of illusion, or it's a kind of structure that we create. But in actual fact, we can never get it because we're within it. We are continually part of the process of
The horizon. That the
horizon,
more you
right?
talk to it, the more
It's
it moves
always
from.
moving. Like when we say, okay, it's here, the time we took to expend to discover the here-ness of where all being originated from or whatever, right? The starting point already shifted. Further back, if you will, right? And every time we try to catch it, we can't. There's that infinitesimal gap, that object A, the whole kind of thing Lacan described of the symptom of the subject and jouissance as object A, and it's this continual cat and mouse chase. You can never catch the mouse or whatever, right? Of desire. And so in any
We're not
case,
quick enough to live in the West.
what do you
That's
mean? I didn't get that.
You don't know the expression, we're not quick enough to live in the West.
No,
Whenever you just miss something, it's like you're not quick enough to live in the West because of
I'm
the
hearing that for the
slavers.
first time.
And it's the same thing. You go grab it, and as soon as you go grab it, it's always quicker than you. It moves
Yeah.
before you can even move to get it.
Hmm.
I wanted to say something about a point you made earlier, with which I thought was brilliant. I think at its core, what these people have is insecurity about their commitment to Marxism, such that they have this deep fear of eclecticism. They don't want to fall into eclecticism, and so the combination of their insecurity and their fear of eclecticism, they see a guy drawing insights from Heidegger, Dugin, Zizek, French theorists, and they're like, what the fuck is this? This is eclecticism. I'm not even going to explore it because it presents an even worse danger than reading any one of these guys. It's like all of them, it's like this monstrosity. And at its core, I think it's a lack of faith in the fact that you can go through all of that. You can pull stuff from all of that and still be, not only still be, but the way to be a real Marxist-Leninist is to have the faith to go through all of that and stay true to your commitments. And that's one of the things that this is why even early on, when I wasn't fully sold either on Heidegger or any of the stuff, I never wanted to critique because it's like it was evident that the Marxism-Leninism was there. There was no fucking the essence of eclecticism is this diluting of Marxism, turning Marxism into something it isn't. I see that a hell of a lot more in the people that fear the eclecticism than I've ever seen it in you.
Maybe I have such a disregard for that fear that people have because maybe I'm like an Islamic terrorist. You know, maybe I'm trying to make a point that the real
This is going to be
faith.
cited in our Wikipedia. I hope you know that, where we're told.
Maybe the point I'm trying to make is that, you know, the real thing, the real faith, it's not an ideal. All ideals deserve to be debased and torn apart from within in every kind of fucking which way, so that we can get the true kernel, the real essence. And I remain a Marxist, I guess, and that has order and structure. Like I'm a Marxist-Leninist, I'm a Marxist, but that's not an ideal to me. That is a like structure. That is like a language of praxis.
A way of being in the world.
Yeah, it's a language of praxis. Are you kidding? Like that is the Quran to me, Marxism, Leninism. Like that's not a series of fucking ideals. Every ideologist is fucking wrong from the get-go. Why? Because these are motherfuckers sitting around doing nothing. Yep. Like I'm saying this even in a vulgar sense. Like even Lysenko was growing crops. He's doing something, right? Literally, he was. The crop yields were higher. So, you know, there's a default like wrongness to ideology that I insist on. I think ideology is inherently false. I know that both late Althusser and Zizek have a very refined understanding of ideology. Right. I think especially late Althusser, I think, right? Ideology and ideological state apparatuses. When does he write? There's the 60s, right?
Yeah, I want to say 70s, actually.
Is it? Is it his earlier or later text? There's something he writes in 1970. So later, I believe in For Marx, There's an essay he publishes later.
That's
Later.
64, I think.
What?
For Marx, I think is 64.
For Marx?
Yeah.
Yeah, I must be inverting them. I could be inverting them. But where he writes about his understanding of ideology as well, I don't want to get into it. ALTHUSSER. By the way, he's the most boring fucking thinker.
Horrible writing.
He is the worst writer from the entire. Like, I think one of the things that made me despise Spinozism was precisely ALTHUSSER's, because it's this dry. It's precisely like Spinozism. Spinoza's he's this ruthlessly boring materialist. And it's torture. It's fucking torture. And it's like, I don't want to get anti-Semitic here, so I won't.
But
it's like
referencing the parts of Stalin in the problem of linguistics, the Talmudic formalist and shit.
Oh my, it's so dry and fucking boring. I want to kill myself reading ALTHUSSER. He's the worst writer ever. And just getting anything good out of him takes so much. I mean, this is how Paul must have felt. Rummaging through the old Talmud or old, Testament texts or something and deriving the light of Christ. Sorry, that's enough anti-Semitism, guys. Well, yeah, I know ALTHUSSER is a horrible writer, but okay, back to what I was trying to say. I think ideology is inherently wrong. I do disagree with ALTHUSSER fundamentally about, he defines ideology in a way I object to. And also which Zizek takes for granted, right? But, to me, I think that the necessity of the ALTHUSSERian notion of ideology, which you see in Zizek as well, is that, well, should we return to a naive realism? And no, absolutely not. That's why I'm more interested in that's why Dugin is so interesting. If you really think about it, you take away this dogmatic notion of ideology and you start filling that in with other things can get interesting. You can still understand how reality has this kind of special determination, not just being this kind of the one-sided substance or object of empiricism, and still be rational and determinate and stuff. And like Dugin's notion of logoi, and I'm kind of exploring the notion of, I call it principle, right? That's what I call it, principle. And principle is a beautiful word, kind of, because it's like, the Bible, how it says we're not governed by whatever, it's principalities, and principle is like the tendency of the governing tendency of things, and understanding things in a Deleuzian sense as kind of like fields of intensity and pure becoming and so on and so on. But then understanding how these are malformed by principles that have specific orientations and tendencies. So it's like you can combine Lacan's notion of symptom and symptom with that or whatever. But it's like, that's what I'm interested in more. But that is the key thing is that these are praxeological, which is a term that the Austrians stole, which would have been great if we kept it. These are kind of praxeological notions, which imply a relationship of thought to practice and vice versa, not a relationship of thought just to itself. That's what ideology is. It's, if you want to put it in Eugen terms, it's just various different coping mechanisms for being a fucking cuckold wage slave or being a kind of fucking, conformist or whatever, political conformist. It's like all the things that are preventing you from really adopting an authentic revolutionary subjectivity or outlook and the ability to actually bravely act upon that, in ways that contradict. And the thing you mentioned about psychosis, I guess the final thing I say, the problem with psychosis is that it's the psychotic subject is preempted in their actions, however antisocial and however contrary to society, by the guarantee of some kind of fixed imaginary structure or form. So the psychotic subject, like Austin Redguard or something, they need a kind of fetishistic they need to enclose the signifier, right? You talked about kind of escaping the signifier. It's more like an enclosure. They enclose it. Foreclosure is actually the term Lacan uses. They foreclose the signifier. It's kind of like a suppression, and then they kind of have this absolute certainty in the consistency of an imaginary form. Like, shit, I wish I had my gun. Do you support Chairman Gonzalo? Yes or no? Y or N? And if you say no, it's like this fanaticism of this empty, robotic, terrifying, and yeah, it's autistic. According to Lacan, autism is a form of psychosis. Let's never forget that. And it can be anything. For some people, it's a Sonic the Hedgehog, or it's some kind of cartoon character, or for Carlos, it's the Ninja Turtles.
You know how hard it was when the conversation got serious to not think about me saying it wasn't in a racial sense, because that was a tough one.
I still don't get that at all.
Because it's a brown. Because I didn't call you the Ninja Turtle. I called you the Master, who's like a brown rat that goes.
No,
around.
you didn't call me that. You said the Ninja Turtle.
No. I said the Master Rat.
Master Chief. No, that's from Kung Fu Panda.
Yes, because we were talking about infrared and what your position on it was, and I said, look, I just see you as like the rat, the fucking master of the Ninja Turtles, and I said not in a racial sense because the rat is brown.
Wait, Carlos, but you know that the rumors I'm Jewish are not true, right?
Oh, I don't know.
That's the most anti-Semitic thing I've said the entire time.
No, but that's a good rat. It's a brown rat, and it's got a fucking stick, kung fu stick, and it helped all the Ninja Turtles become based.
You know, the Nazis, they also called Jews rats, Carlos.
I'm so anti-Semitic. I'm so non-anti-Semitic. I didn't even get the rat reference. Wink, wink.
Right, because you descend from the most inclusive, literally the most inclusive place in the world. You guys have no anti-Semitism.
No.
In Cuba, nothing.
Oh, I thought you were talking about Miami. But,
no, I'm talking about the real origins.
The real origin, yeah.
The true homeland.
It's so it's so already after all that like racist jokes, everything is like fair game because it's always already assumed that it's not that it's not with any hatred in your heart.
Yeah. I was somehow, but the Spanish Empire, Spain was so crazy with it. They were like, they invented it basically.
The racism or the anti-Semitism?
The anti-Semitism, they pretty much invented it, right?
Well, there's some theorists who would argue otherwise against the legacy that's been imposed on the image of Spain. But I'll refrain from judgment.
Right. Anyway,
is there anything you'd like to plug before we? I'm sure everyone fucking who's watching this already follows you everywhere. But anything you want to plug? When are you gonna write more? I keep for those listeners.
I'm trying this month. I wanted to do it before the new year, but I spent the day rearranging my desk instead.
Yeah.
So well, yeah.
All right, guys. This has been a very fun and unique episode of Escaping the Cave. Hopefully, we can have more like this. And this is an invitation also towards any of the professional philosophers. If any of them want to come in and speak to myself or Haz. If Gabriel's listening, if you ever want to speak to Haz, I'd be happy to arrange such a conversation. I think it would be interesting.
I'd be open. Yeah. I'm thinking that he's like waving his finger like these French guys. No, you can't. I don't know.
Anyways, all right. Well, see you, brother. Hope you have a good night. See you, everyone.